I could sense the weight of unsaid words as soon as we entered Emily's parents' opulent dining room. The long mahogany table was suspended in midair, adorned with the finest china cutlery, flawlessly polished, and a variety of foods that smelled just as opulent as they looked. To an outsider, this would have appeared to be a pleasant family gathering, with wine glasses clinking, laughter, and polite conversation. But I knew better. I had spent years walking into this house, understanding that beneath the surface, something was always brewing. Emily, my wife, walked a little ahead, tension building like a storm ready to explode. With her hand on my arm, she whispered, "Let's just get through tonight." I nodded and smiled, just a little, but I knew exactly what was going to happen. It always did. At the head of the table sat Henry, my father-in-law. Despite his wide smile and charming demeanor, he had a long history of financial disasters, each leaving him in ruins. And yet he always found someone else to blame. When things went wrong, he never took responsibility. He just kept pointing fingers. And tonight, his target was me. Dinner began politely enough. The conversation drifted, through family gossip, business updates, and light-hearted chatter. But I wasn't naive. I noticed how Henry kept glancing at me, his mouth set in a tight line. He was waiting for his moment. And then, it arrived. He stood, tapping his fingers furiously against his wine glass. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor cut through. The noise. The room fell silent. He cleared his throat, adjusting his suit like a politician about to deliver a grand speech. I had seen this performance far too many times. "Family," he began, his deep voice carrying a weight of importance. "There's something that needs to be said tonight." He paused, his eyes locking onto mine. I braced myself. Henry spread his arms dramatically. "We are a family that supports one another, aren't we?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded, others simply watched. Emily sat next to him, perfectly still, her hands neatly folded in her lap. But in her gaze, I saw hesitation. She knew exactly where this was headed. Henry turned to me. "Daniel," he said, his tone dripping with forced camaraderie. "You've done well for yourself. We're all so proud of you." The words rolled off his tongue, but his voice held something that wasn't quite admiration. I didn't respond. I knew there was more. He dragged out the moment, carefully crafting his next statement. But what kind of man succeeds? And then, forgets those who helped him get there? There it was. The accusation, the setup. Henry was making his move, and I could feel the energy in the room shift. People tensed in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. I stayed silent, my expression unreadable. Emily stirred beside him, lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but Henry had already set the stage. "I've always believed family looks out for one another," he continued. "When someone is struggling, we don't turn our backs." His voice grew louder, conviction rising as he played to his audience. And then, the final blow. "Knowing all the hardships I've endured, after everything I've done for you and Emily, you refuse to help me?" Gasps, murmurs. Eyes darted to me, waiting for my reaction. Emily finally spoke. "Dad, maybe—" Henry ignored her. He turned back to me, lowering his voice. "Tell me, Daniel," he whispered, "do you really think you did it all on your own?" I didn't flinch, didn't blink. I simply met his gaze, feeling the weight of his arrogance pressing down on me. This wasn't new. For years, he had hinted at this, his delusional belief that he was somehow responsible for my success, that I owed him something, but I had worked for everything I had. Brick by brick, no shortcuts, no handouts. So I leaned back in my chair and said calmly, "I don't remember ever asking you for anything, Henry." A whisper rippled through the room. Henry's face darkened. He hadn't expected me to confront him so directly. Emily's voice was soft. "Daniel, please. Family is important." I turned to my wife. the woman I had built a life with. But at that moment, I saw something I had been ignoring for years: unquestioning loyalty, blind devotion, and then the words that changed everything. "You owe us for your success." Silence. A dagger of betrayal hung heavy in the air. I clenched my fists under the table, staring at them both. This wasn't about money. This was about control. And Henry, seeing my silence, mistook it for submission. But what they didn't realize was that I had come prepared. When this evening ended, I would leave them all in stunned silence, because I knew the truth, and the truth would shatter them. He lurched forward, scraping his chair, and a bit of his voice exploded with ungratefulness. His hands erupted in wrath, distorting his face as he slammed loudly into the floor. But before he could get in touch with me, a hand shot out. Matt, Emily's cousin, a former college football player. In mid-stride, the player grabbed Henry and pushed him back into his seat. Henry's grip was solid, and his voice was sharp, but he was unable to get past Matt. In the room, despite his chest heaving, voices overlapped, and the air filled with gasps as mayhem broke out. Emily was on her feet, her eyes widened in shock. Henry stopped, looking around and noticing that for the first time in his life, the entire room had turned against him. His manipulation had failed. When he was outplayed, I stood up gently, rolled up my sleeves, and spoke calmly. "Despite the confusion, you desired a public altercation, Henry." I glanced around the room, taking in the family. I turned and left, hoping it was worthwhile, because the truth had already caused harm, and Henry would never get over it. As I took a step back and observed Henry struggling in his chair, I experienced a sudden realization. He was furious with me. His face twisted. In rage, but he stopped shouting. He was aware that the materials I had disclosed had undermined his meticulously constructed story. The rest of the family sat in startled silence, their eyes bouncing between Henry and me, like fans at a game they hadn't realized they were attending. Some looked appalled, others betrayed. But the most striking response was the unquestionable lack of support for Henry. When his deception was finally exposed, I turned to Emily. She sat frozen, her eyes focused on the table, her hands gripping the edge as if she needed something sturdy to hold on to. I placed the documents on the table and noticed something deeper than rage: doubt and uncertainty. Emily, who had once expressed skepticism about her father, now faced a reality she couldn't ignore. I spoke in a steady, firm tone. "Were you aware of this?" Her lips parted, but when she finally responded, her voice was barely above a whisper. Her breathing was irregular. She was in shock, but I examined her face carefully. She was telling the truth. This was new to her. Henry wasn't the type to leave a paper trail. His machinations thrived on portraying himself as a victim, fabricating sob stories and controlling emotions. The whispers in the room grew louder. Family members leaned in, their faces shifting from disgusted to enraged. Emily's aunt, Linda, abruptly rose from the other side of the table. I glanced over just in time to witness her clamping her lips together and shaking her head in shock, before she laughed bitterly. Henry's voice carried across the room as he tried to explain who owed whom. But then, for the first time, I saw it. A look of genuine dread in his eyes. Linda inhaled deeply and clenched her fists. "Since we're revealing the truth tonight, let me ask you a question, Henry. When exactly do you plan to reimburse me for the $50,000 you stole?" The room erupted in gasps. Henry's head shot toward her, his mouth opening, but Linda cut him off with a sharp laugh. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he stammered. She slammed her hands onto the table. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. 8 years ago, you told me about an incredible business opportunity. You said you just needed a small investment, that I'd get double in 6 months. But what really happened, Henry?" Henry's face turned red, but his mouth stayed shut. "You vanished." Linda's voice quivered with rage. You stopped returning my calls and messages. And when I finally got a hold of you, you gave me some bullshit excuse about the market crashing. Then you had the nerve to ask for more money. Several family members exchanged uneasy glances. Others glared at Henry. Emily's fingers shook as she glanced between her father and Linda. Then Emily's cousin David spoke up. "Wait," he said, standing slowly. "Henry, didn't you ask me for money last year?" A fresh wave of whispers surged through the room. Henry's head jerked toward David in panic. "David, please take a seat," Henry said, his voice eerily calm. But David wasn't backing down. "You told me you had emergency medical bills that needed $20,000 to cover?" His eyes blazed. That was a lie, wasn't it? The pieces were falling into place. Henry was unraveling. More voices joined in. "He told me he needed money for a legal case." "Wait, 2 years ago he said it was for his car." The realization crashed over the family. Henry had been bleeding them all dry. One by one, accusations flew, tempers flared. The room was no longer against me. It was against Henry. "This is crazy!" Henry yelled, his hands shaking. "You're all turning against me?" Linda scoffed. "And here you were," she said, "lecturing everyone about owing the family." Emily's face was pale. Her fingers still clutched the table as she processed everything. For the first time, she saw her father not as a flawed man who made mistakes, but as a thief, a liar. Linda's voice cut through the chaos. "You always thought you could manipulate us. But let's talk about what you did to my sister. Your own wife." Emily's breath hitched. "You drained her finances. You crushed her spirit. And when she was at her lowest, you abandoned her." Murmurs filled the room. Linda's gaze flicked to Emily. "Did you ever wonder why your mother was always so worried about